Hyunjin finally confesses a love he hid for years, and Felix's silence changes everything between them forever. The rain hit the rooftop so hard it sounded like shattered glass, and Felix almost didn't hear Hyunjin's voice over the storm. "I've loved you since the beginning." Froze, not because of the cold, not because his soaked hoodie clung to his skin, or because his hands were trembling from exhaustion after another endless rehearsal, but because Hyunjin looked terrified after saying it. The city lights blurred behind him, reflecting in puddles scattered across the rooftop floor. Neon reds and pale blues painted Hyunjin's face in broken colors, while the wind pushed strands of wet blonde hair across his eyes. His breathing was uneven, sharp, almost painful. Felix stared at him without blinking. For a moment, the world lost all sound. No thunder, no rain, no traffic below, nothing, only those words, "I've loved you since the beginning." Hyunjin let out a shaky laugh, but it sounded empty. "Say something." Opened his mouth, but no words came out, because suddenly every memory returned at once. The late nights in practice rooms. The way Hyunjin always waited for him after schedules even when everyone else had gone home. The silent cups of coffee left outside his studio door. The jealous glances Hyunjin tried to hide whenever Felix got too close to someone else. The nights Felix caught Hyunjin staring at him like he wanted to say something but swallowed it every single time. Felix had noticed all of it. He just never allowed himself to believe it meant anything. "You're joking," Felix whispered finally. Hyunjin's eyes darkened immediately. That reaction hurt more than Felix expected. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The question came quietly, but there was years of pain buried inside it. Felix's chest tightened. Hyunjin looked away first, gripping the cold metal railing so hard his knuckles turned pale. "Forget it, I shouldn't have said anything." "No, I knew this would happen." Bitterness in Hyunjin's voice shocked him. Felix had seen Hyunjin angry before, emotional, dramatic, sensitive, but never defeated. Rainwater dripped from Hyunjin's jaw as he laughed again under his breath. "I practiced saying it 100 times, you know that." Felix couldn't move, his mind felt fractured. Because part of him wanted to run, and another part wanted to grab Hyunjin before he walked away forever. "I thought maybe tonight would finally be different," Hyunjin continued softly. "You looked at me differently during rehearsal." Remembered, during the final song the lights had dimmed around them, and Hyunjin's hand brushed against his wrist for half a second too long. Felix felt his heartbeat stumble then, but he ignored it, like he always did. Because Felix had spent years building walls around himself. He was terrified of ruining things, terrified of being abandoned, terrified of wanting someone too much. And Hyunjin had always been dangerous to his heart. "You don't understand," Felix said quietly. Hyunjin looked at him again. "Then explain it to me." Inhaled sharply. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? Ever since debut, he had trained himself to smile through loneliness. He became the comforting one, the sunshine everyone leaned on. But nobody noticed how often he stayed awake until sunrise, staring at the ceiling, wondering why he always felt empty after the cameras stopped rolling. Nobody except Hyunjin. Hyunjin noticed everything. That was the problem. "You make me scared," Felix admitted. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Hyunjin blinked slowly. Felix looked down at his shaking hands. "Because when I'm with you, I forget how to protect myself." Storm around them softened into distant noise. Hyunjin stepped closer carefully, like Felix might disappear if he moved too fast. "You think I don't feel the same?" he whispered. Felix could smell rain and faint vanilla from Hyunjin's hoodie, close enough now to hear the uneven rhythm of his breathing. "I tried to stop loving you," Hyunjin confessed. "I dated other people. I avoided you. I even convinced myself I hated you for a while." Looked up immediately, Hyunjin smiled weakly. Didn't work. Something inside Felix cracked, because Hyunjin's eyes were wet now and Felix couldn't tell if it was rain or tears. "You know what the worst part is?" Hyunjin continued. "Every time you smiled at me, I fell harder." His chest hurt. The honesty in Hyunjin's voice was unbearable. No performance, no jokes, no masks, just raw truth. A truth Hyunjin had apparently carried alone for years. "Why now?" Felix asked quietly. Hyunjin hesitated, then he finally answered. "Because yesterday I heard you talking about leaving." Stiffened. He hadn't expected that a few nights ago, exhausted and emotionally wrecked after another public controversy, Felix had privately admitted to Chan that sometimes he wondered if disappearing would make life easier. He never imagined Hyunjin overheard. "You scared me," Hyunjin whispered. "I realized if I lost my chance without telling you, I'd regret it forever." Suddenly couldn't breathe properly, because underneath Hyunjin's confession was fear. Real fear, the fear of losing someone before they knew they were loved. Hyunjin laughed bitterly again and wiped his face with his sleeve. "You don't have to say anything back. I already know this changes everything." "It does," Felix admitted softly. Pain flashed across Hyunjin's face for a split second. Felix immediately reached for him. His fingers wrapped around Hyunjin's wrist before he could think twice. Hyunjin stopped moving. The contact felt electric, warm despite the freezing rain. Felix swallowed hard. "I don't know what to do with feelings like this," he whispered honestly. "I've spent so long pretending they weren't real." Hyunjin looked at him carefully, silently. Felix's voice trembled. "But every time something bad happens to me, you're the first person I look for." Hyunjin's breathing caught. "And every time you smile at someone else," Felix continued, "I hate it." Confession lingered between them like another storm waiting to break. Hyunjin stared at him with widening eyes. Felix almost laughed at how terrifying vulnerability felt. No one's ever had this much power over me before, Felix admitted. For the first time that night, Hyunjin stepped closer without hesitation, close enough that Felix could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the cold rain surrounding them. You have no idea, Hyunjin whispered shakily, how long I waited to hear that. Looked at him for a long moment, then finally understood something that had been haunting him for years. He had never been afraid of Hyunjin loving him. He was afraid of loving Hyunjin back so much that losing him would destroy him completely, and maybe it already had. The rooftop lights flickered softly above them while thunder rolled across the dark sky. Hyunjin slowly lifted his hand, hesitant. Giving Felix every chance to pull away, Felix didn't. Instead, he leaned forward first, resting his forehead carefully against Hyunjin's. The world suddenly felt quiet again, not empty this time, just peaceful. Hyunjin closed his eyes instantly like he had dreamed about this moment for years. Felix felt tears burning unexpectedly behind his own eyes. You idiot, he whispered with a weak smile. Hyunjin laughed shakily. Yeah, you should have told me sooner. The first time in a very long time, neither of them felt alone anymore. The dorm was silent when they returned, but silence had never felt this loud before. Felix could still feel the warmth of Hyunjin's forehead against his own even after they stepped out of the elevator. His heartbeat hadn't calmed down once during the ride home. Every glance between them felt dangerous now, charged with something impossible to hide. Hyunjin walked half a step behind him through the hallway, unusually quiet. That scared Felix more than the confession itself, because Hyunjin was never quiet when he was comfortable. The moment the dorm door opened, laughter spilled into the hallway. Changbin was arguing with Han over instant noodles while Sumin sat on the couch pretending not to care, though the corner of his mouth twitched every few seconds. The television glowed softly across the dark living room, filling the dorm with familiar warmth. Everything looked normal. But Felix felt like his entire world had changed. Chan looked up first, and immediately noticed something was wrong, or different. His eyes moved between Felix and Hyunjin carefully. Both of them were soaked from the rain, standing too stiffly beside each other. Chan narrowed his eyes slightly. You two okay? Felix answered too quickly. Yeah, Hyunjin answered at the exact same time. No, everyone turned toward them instantly. Felix nearly choked. Hyunjin looked horrified at himself. Han burst out laughing first. That's suspicious. I meant physically, Hyunjin corrected awkwardly, removing his wet hoodie. We're freezing, Changbin pointed dramatically. That sounds exactly like something guilty people say. Forced a smile, but his pulse was racing, because Hyunjin couldn't stop looking at him, not openly, not obviously, but Felix noticed every stolen glance now, and somehow that made everything worse, or maybe better, he couldn't tell anymore. You should shower before you get sick, Chan said gently, though his eyes lingered on Felix for a second longer than usual. Felix nodded quickly and escaped down the hallway before anyone could ask more questions. The bathroom door shut behind him with a sharp click. Finally alone, Felix leaned against the sink immediately, gripping the edges so tightly his fingers hurt. His reflection looked unfamiliar, red cheeks, shaking hands, eyes still full of emotion he couldn't process. I've loved you since the beginning. The memory hit him again like lightning. Felix covered his face with both hands. This was bad, dangerously bad, because now that Hyunjin had finally said it aloud, Felix couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He loved him too, maybe he always had. The realization settled slowly into his chest, heavy and terrifying. He remembered the first time he noticed Hyunjin differently years ago, before debut, a tiny practice room filled with exhaustion and frustration. Felix had been struggling with Korean pronunciation again, repeating the same line until his throat burned. The others had already gone home, only Hyunjin stayed. Felix remembered the embarrassment vividly. The humiliation of feeling inadequate while everyone else improved faster than him. I'm holding everyone back, Felix had muttered bitterly. Hyunjin looked genuinely angry after hearing that. You think we'd let you stay if you meant nothing to us? Felix remembered freezing then too. Because Hyunjin sounded personally offended by the idea of losing him. Back then, Felix told himself it was friendship. Now he wasn't so sure anymore. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Felix stiffened immediately. Lix, Hyunjin, just hearing his voice now made Felix's chest ache. You've been in there 20 minutes, Hyunjin said quietly through the door. Are you okay? No, not even close. Felix inhaled shakily before unlocking the door. Hyunjin stood outside in grey sweatpants and a black hoodie, damp hair falling into tired eyes. He looked softer without stage makeup. More vulnerable, more real. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Hyunjin smiled nervously and Felix's heart betrayed him all over again. You're staring, Hyunjin whispered. Felix blinked hard. Sorry, Hyunjin leaned lightly against the wall beside the bathroom door. Don't apologize for that. Hallway suddenly felt too small, too warm. Felix looked away first. That made Hyunjin laugh softly under his breath. There you are, he murmured. Felix frowned. What? The Felix who gets shy? I don't get shy. Hyunjin raised an eyebrow immediately. Felix groaned. Okay, maybe sometimes, only around me. That answer came too fast, too confident. Felix looked up sharply. Hyunjin's expression softened instantly after realizing what he admitted. I notice things, he said quietly. Yeah, Felix knew that already. That was the problem. Hyunjin stepped closer carefully. You know what I used to think, Felix swallowed hard. What, that you hated being alone as much as I do? Honesty in Hyunjin's voice hurt unexpectedly, because it was true. Felix spent years surrounding himself with noise because silence reminded him too much of the loneliness he tried to outrun. But somehow Hyunjin always noticed the moments when Felix's smile faded, even the tiny ones, especially those. You looked lonely even when everyone loved you, Hyunjin whispered. Felix felt his throat tighten immediately. Nobody had ever described him that accurately before. Hyunjin looked down briefly before continuing. And I think that's when I realized I was already in too deep. Couldn't breathe properly again. There was something devastating about hearing how long Hyunjin had carried these feelings alone. Years, entire years. How did you hide it? Felix asked softly. Hyunjin laughed once, tired and broken. Badly, smiled despite himself. Hyunjin stared at him instantly after that smile appeared, like he couldn't help it, like Felix was the only thing in the world worth looking at, and suddenly Felix understood why this had terrified him so much, because Hyunjin loved openly, completely, without protecting himself. Felix had spent his entire life avoiding pain. Hyunjin ran straight into it if it meant loving someone honestly. The realization made Felix emotional in ways he couldn't explain. Hyunjin said softly. Felix looked up again. Hyunjin's expression shifted immediately after seeing his eyes. You're crying. Touched his face in surprise, warm tears. He hadn't even noticed them falling. Embarrassed, he turned away quickly, but Hyunjin caught his wrist gently before he could escape. That single touch unraveled him completely. I'm sorry, Felix whispered shakily. For what? I don't know. Hyunjin's face broke a little after hearing that. You apologize too much when you're hurting. The sentence hit Felix harder than expected because it sounded practiced. Like Hyunjin had been watching him suffer quietly for years, Felix's vision blurred again. Hyunjin hesitated only once before pulling him carefully closer. Felix melted almost immediately, not dramatically, not suddenly. Just slowly collapsing against someone who had apparently been waiting to hold him forever. Hyunjin's arms wrapped around him tightly, protectively. Felix buried his face into Hyunjin's shoulder, overwhelmed by warmth and the faint scent of fabric softener mixed with rain. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The dorm remained noisy somewhere in the distance. But here in the dim hallway, everything felt fragile and soft. I don't know what happens now, Felix admitted quietly against Hyunjin's shoulder. Hyunjin held him tighter. We figure it out slowly. Closed his eyes slowly. For once, that didn't sound frightening. Then Hyunjin whispered something so quietly Felix almost missed it. You have no idea how happy I am that it's you. Somehow those words shattered the last wall Felix still had left inside him.
Felix didn't realize how long they stayed like that in the hallway. Time blurred inside Hyunjin's arms. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't racing toward schedules, expectations, or fear. The constant pressure inside his chest softened every time Hyunjin's fingers brushed carefully against his back. It felt terrifyingly safe, and Felix wasn't used to safety. A loud yell suddenly echoed from the living room. You two are secretly crying without us. I'm going to be offended. Han, of course. Felix pulled away instantly, nearly stumbling backward in panic. Hyunjin burst into laughter for the first time that night. Real laughter, warm and breathless. Felix stared at him without thinking. God, Hyunjin looked beautiful when he smiled like that. You're doing it again, Hyunjin teased softly. Felix blinked. Doing what? Looking at me like I hung the moon. Entire face burned immediately. I do not. You absolutely do. Shoved his shoulder weakly, but Hyunjin only laughed harder. The sound filled the hallway so naturally that Felix's chest ached unexpectedly, because Hyunjin had looked sad for so long, and Felix hated realizing he was part of the reason. Come on, Hyunjin said gently after calming down. Before Han breaks the door down. Felix hesitated. Reality waited on the other side of that hallway, the others, questions, normal life pretending nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Hyunjin noticed the hesitation immediately. His expression softened again. We don't have to tell anyone yet. Looked at him carefully. You'd be okay with that. I waited years already, Hyunjin said quietly. I can wait a little longer if you need time. Answer made guilt twist painfully inside Felix, because Hyunjin always gave more than he received, even now, especially now. Felix looked down briefly before speaking. I don't want to hide because I'm ashamed. Hyunjin's eyes widened slightly. Felix forced himself to continue despite the nervousness clawing inside him. I'm just scared. Of us? No, Felix looked up again. Of losing this. Something vulnerable flickered across Hyunjin's face. Then slowly, carefully, he reached for Felix's hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like they already belonged there. You won't lose me, Hyunjin whispered. The certainty in his voice nearly destroyed Felix emotionally, because nobody had ever said those words to him like they intended to stay forever. Felix squeezed Hyunjin's hand once before finally walking with him toward the living room. The second they entered, 6 pairs of eyes locked onto them immediately. Silence, dangerous silence. Then Seungmin narrowed his eyes. "Why are you holding hands?" Felix nearly died. Hyunjin, however, looked completely calm, too calm. "We have fingers," Hyunjin answered casually. Changbin stared at him. "That's the worst explanation you could have given." Sat up dramatically on the couch. "Wait!" Felix felt panic rise instantly, hand pointed between them like a detective solving a crime. "You confessed, didn't you?" The room exploded. "I knew it," Changbin shouted. Chan looked exhausted immediately. "Can we not scream? Who confessed first?" Jeongin asked loudly. Felix wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Hyunjin, traitor that he was, looked amused. "Guys," Chan interrupted carefully, looking between both of them. "Are you serious?" That question changed the atmosphere instantly. The teasing faded, because suddenly this wasn't a joke anymore. Felix looked at the members surrounding him, the people who had become family through years of struggle and survival. And for the first time, he realized how terrified he had been of this exact moment. Not rejection, disappointment, Chain. But then Chan smiled softly, small, gentle, relieved, and Felix almost cried again. "Oh," Chan said quietly. "Finally!" Blinked in shock. Hyunjin looked equally stunned. "Finally!" Chan folded his arms. "You two have been emotionally staring at each other for years." Seungmin nodded immediately. "It was painful to witness." "I lost sleep because of your unresolved tension," Han added dramatically. Jeongin pointed at Felix. "You literally smile differently when Hyunjin walks into a room." Covered his burning face with both hands. "Please stop talking." Looked genuinely offended. "You think we're blind?" Hyunjin was laughing again beside him now, shoulders shaking quietly. Felix turned toward him in disbelief. "You think this is funny? A little. Evil. You like me." Froze, the room instantly erupted into chaos again. "My God," Han screamed. Chan buried his face into his hands. "We're never getting peace again." Wanted to disappear. But beneath the embarrassment, something warm spread slowly through his chest, because nobody looked angry, nobody looked uncomfortable, they looked happy, truly happy. And somehow that made everything more emotional than Felix expected. Later that night, after the teasing finally calmed down and everyone slowly disappeared into their rooms, Felix stood alone on the balcony outside the dorm. The city glowed beneath him quietly. Cold wind brushed against his skin, but his mind felt strangely calm. The balcony door slid open behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Hyunjin. "You vanished," Hyunjin said softly. Felix smiled faintly. "Needed air." Hyunjin stepped beside him, leaning against the railing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Comfortable silence, the kind Felix usually hated, but not with him, never with him. "You know," Hyunjin murmured eventually, "I used to imagine this moment all the time." Glanced sideways. "Really?" "Yeah," Hyunjin smiled to himself, eyes focused on the city lights below. "Most versions, you rejected me." His chest tightened painfully. "Hyunjin, it's okay," Hyunjin interrupted gently. "I understood why you were scared before you even said it." Looked down at his hands. "I think part of me believed loving someone this much always ends badly." The confession slipped out quietly into the night air. Hyunjin turned toward him fully after hearing that. Felix laughed weakly. "Parents used to fight constantly before everything fell apart. I think I learned early that caring about people too deeply just gives them more ways to hurt you." The words tasted bitter leaving his mouth. He rarely talked about these things aloud. Hyunjin's expression softened immediately. "You're not them." Looked up. "I'm not going anywhere." Hyunjin continued softly, simple words, but Felix felt them everywhere in his chest, his throat, his heartbeat. Hyunjin stepped closer slowly until their shoulders brushed lightly together. "I don't need things to be perfect," he whispered. "I just need them to be real." Closed his eyes briefly. Real. That word scared him. But somehow it also felt comforting when Hyunjin said it. "You know what I realized tonight?" Felix admitted quietly. "What?" "I think I started loving you long before I admitted it to myself." Hyunjin went completely still beside him. Felix laughed nervously after noticing. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Because," Hyunjin said carefully, "you just said you love me." His breath caught. Oh, he had. The realization hit him seconds too late. Hyunjin stared at him like the world had stopped spinning. Felix felt his heart pounding violently now. But this time he didn't run from it. Instead, he looked directly into Hyunjin's eyes and whispered the words again. "I love you." The city lights blurred below them. Hyunjin looked completely overwhelmed. Like he had spent years starving emotionally and suddenly didn't know what to do after finally being given something gentle. Then he smiled, small at first, then brighter, until Felix could physically see happiness spreading across his face. And somehow that expression alone made every fear inside Felix feel worth surviving. Hyunjin kissed him before he could think too much about it, soft, careful, almost hesitant. Like he was still afraid Felix might disappear if he moved too fast. Felix's breath caught immediately. The city noise below them faded into nothing as Hyunjin's hand slowly lifted to his cheek, fingertips cold from the night air. The kiss wasn't dramatic or desperate. It was worse. It was gentle. And Felix had always been weak against gentleness. His eyes closed instinctively as warmth spread through his chest so suddenly it almost hurt. Hyunjin smelled faintly like rain and fabric softener, familiar enough to make Felix emotional all over again. When Hyunjin finally pulled away, neither of them spoke. They just stared at each other silently, breathing unevenly, processing. Felix realized his hands were gripping the front of Hyunjin's hoodie tightly. Hyunjin noticed, too, that small detail made him smile softly. "You're shaking," he whispered. Felix laughed nervously. "This is your fault. I'll take responsibility." Answer came immediately, without hesitation, and for some reason that nearly broke Felix apart emotionally. Because Hyunjin always answered like he meant everything completely. No games, no pretending, just honesty so raw it frightened him sometimes. Felix looked down briefly, trying to calm the overwhelming emotions inside him, but Hyunjin gently tilted his chin back up. "Hiding now," Hyunjin murmured. Felix swallowed hard. "You really see everything, huh? Only you." Way Hyunjin said it made Felix's heart stutter painfully. God, how long had Hyunjin loved him like this? Years. Actual years. Felix suddenly remembered dozens of tiny moments differently now. The way Hyunjin unconsciously searched for him first in crowded rooms. The way his mood shifted depending on Felix's condition. The late-night messages asking if he ate properly. The silent comfort during panic attacks Felix tried to hide from everyone else. Hyunjin had loved him quietly through all of it, and somehow never asked for anything in return. The realization filled Felix with both warmth and guilt. "I'm sorry," he whispered suddenly. Hyunjin blinked. "For what?" "For making you wait so long." Something fragile crossed Hyunjin's face then, not sadness, something deeper. "You were worth waiting for." Looked away immediately because his eyes burned again. Hyunjin laughed softly under his breath. "You cry a lot around me." "Emotional." "You're adorable," groaned loudly. "Don't start." Too late. Hyunjin looked happier now, lighter. Like years of hidden pain had finally loosened from his shoulders. Felix realized then how exhausted Hyunjin must have been carrying these feelings alone. And suddenly he wanted to protect that smile more than anything. The balcony door suddenly slid open again. Both of them jumped apart instantly. Seungmin stared at them blankly while holding a bottle of water, silence. Then Seungmin slowly nodded once. "Disgusting." Nearly choked. Hyunjin burst out laughing again. "You scared us," Felix complained weakly. Seungmin looked unimpressed. "You're standing 2 centimeters apart staring into each other's souls on a balcony at midnight. What exactly did you expect?" Felix covered his face immediately. Hyunjin leaned casually against the railing again, still smiling. "You jealous?" "Deeply," Seungmin answered dryly before walking back inside. The door closed behind him. A second later they heard hands screaming somewhere inside the dorm. They were Flirting on the balcony. Felix wanted to evaporate into dust. Hyunjin, meanwhile, looked like he was having the best night of his life. "You're enjoying my suffering," Felix accused. "A little." "Unbelievable. But you love me." Stared at him, then quietly answered, "Yeah." The teasing expression on Hyunjin's face disappeared instantly. Every time Felix said it aloud, Hyunjin reacted like he still couldn't fully believe it. And honestly, Felix understood. Because he still couldn't believe this was real either. Hyunjin stepped closer again slowly, almost unconsciously. Like gravity pulled him toward Felix naturally now that he no longer had to hide it. "I think hearing you say that might heal me emotionally," Hyunjin admitted softly. Felix laughed quietly. "You're dramatic. You made me wait years. Let me be emotional." That guilt returned immediately, Felix sighed. "I really didn't know." Hyunjin studied him carefully for a moment, then smiled sadly. "I think part of you knew." Froze, because that was true too. There had always been tension between them, something deeper than friendship hidden underneath years of lingering glances and unfinished conversations. Felix just kept pretending not to see it because acknowledging it felt too dangerous. "You know what scared me most?" Hyunjin asked quietly. Felix shook his head. That one day you'd fall in love with someone else while I stood there pretending to be happy for you. Confession hurt Felix unexpectedly because he could hear how real that fear had been. Hyunjin looked down at the city lights below them. There were nights I genuinely thought about distancing myself from you completely. His chest tightened immediately. But every time I tried, Hyunjin whispered, you'd smile at me or grab my hand or look at me like I mattered, and suddenly I couldn't leave. Eyes burned again. He remembered those moments too, instinctive touches, comfort, trust. He never realized how much hope he accidentally gave Hyunjin without understanding it. I'm sorry, Felix repeated softly. This time Hyunjin shook his head. Apologize for surviving the only way you knew how. The sentence settled deep inside Felix's chest, warm, gentle, dangerous, because Hyunjin understood him in ways nobody else ever fully had. And maybe that was why losing him always felt terrifying even before tonight. Felix stepped closer until their shoulders touched again. Then carefully rested his head against Hyunjin's shoulder. Hyunjin immediately relaxed beside him. Like this was exactly where both of them were meant to be. You know, Felix murmured quietly, I used to think love was supposed to feel overwhelming and painful all the time. Hyunjin tilted his head slightly against his hair. Now, Felix smiled faintly. Now I think maybe it's supposed to feel safe too. For a long moment, Hyunjin didn't answer. Then Felix felt him press a soft kiss against the top of his head. Stay, Hyunjin whispered. Felix closed his eyes. And for the first time in a very long time, staying somewhere didn't feel frightening anymore.
Felix woke up before sunrise with Hyunjin's name still lingering in his chest like a heartbeat. For a few confused seconds, he stared at the ceiling of his room in silence, wondering why everything felt strangely warm. Then memories crashed into him all at once. The rooftop, the confession, the balcony, the kiss, I love you. Buried his face into his pillow immediately. His ears burned. This couldn't be real, except it was, and somehow that realization terrified him even more in daylight. Because nighttime made emotions feel softer. Safer, like secrets protected by darkness, morning made everything real. The dawn was quiet except for faint movement in the kitchen. Felix sat up slowly, still exhausted from barely sleeping. His mind replayed every second from last night over and over until his chest physically hurt from it. Then his phone buzzed beside him. Hyunjin. Felix stared at the notification for 3 full seconds before opening it. Good morning, son. Felix smiled so fast it embarrassed him. Another message appeared immediately. Are you smiling right now? Felix froze, then quickly typed back. How do you know? 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Because I know you. Dropped backward onto the bed dramatically. This was dangerous. Nobody should have this much power over him emotionally before 8 a.m. Another buzz. Come to the kitchen. Inhaled slowly before forcing himself out of bed. The hallway was dim and quiet, sunlight barely creeping through the windows. He could hear soft music playing from the kitchen speakers, low enough not to wake everyone else. When Felix walked in, he stopped immediately. Hyunjin stood by the stove wearing oversized grey sweatpants and one of Felix's hoodies. Felix's brain stopped functioning. That's mine, he blurted out automatically. Hyunjin looked down at the hoodie innocently. Really? You stole it. You left it in my room months ago. That doesn't mean you can emotionally adopt it. Hyunjin laughed quietly, and Felix's chest tightened again at how natural the sound felt now. God, everything was different. And somehow exactly the same too. The kitchen smelled like coffee and pancakes. Morning sunlight painted warm gold across Hyunjin's messy hair while he flipped breakfast with sleepy concentration. Felix suddenly felt something dangerous settle inside him. Domestic happiness. Thoughts scared him so badly he almost turned around and walked out. Hyunjin noticed the shift in his expression immediately. There's the overthinking, he murmured softly. Felix blinked. What? You do this thing where your eyes get distant when you start panicking internally. Stared at him. How do you notice that? Hyunjin gave him a look. Right, stupid question. Felix sat carefully at the counter while Hyunjin poured coffee into his favorite mug without asking. Another detail he remembered. Another detail that ruined Felix emotionally. You remembered. Hyunjin glanced sideways. Of course I did. Looked down at the mug quietly. Nobody had ever paid attention to him this carefully before, not like this, not consistently. It made him feel seen in ways he didn't fully know how to handle. Hyunjin placed a plate in front of him gently before sitting beside him. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, just fragile. Like both of them were still learning this new version of each other, Hyunjin rested his chin against his hand while watching Felix carefully. You're beautiful in the morning. Nearly inhaled coffee into his lungs. Hyunjin, what? You can't just say things like that randomly. Not, it's true. Hid his burning face behind the mug immediately. Hyunjin looked unbearably pleased with himself. You're blushing again. Hate you. No, you, peeked at him over the edge of the mug. Unfortunately, Hyunjin looked soft enough to destroy him completely. Sleepy eyes, messy hair, small smile. Felix looked away first before his heart exploded. You're staring now, Hyunjin whispered teasingly. This relationship is becoming hostile. Relationship, Hyunjin repeated carefully. Felix froze. Oh no, he hadn't meant to say that aloud. Hyunjin looked at him with an expression so openly hopeful that Felix's chest ached instantly. That what this is? Hyunjin asked softly. Felix suddenly felt nervous again, because calling it real somehow made everything more terrifying. But when he looked at Hyunjin, truly looked at him, he saw years of hidden affection, patience and fear sitting quietly behind those eyes. Hyunjin had risked everything by confessing first. Felix couldn't keep running now, so he nodded once, small, shy. Yes. Hyunjin stopped breathing for half a second, then slowly, beautifully, he smiled, not the dramatic smiles he used for cameras. Not playful teasing, this one looked almost fragile, like happiness scared him too. Felix felt emotional all over again. You look like you're about to cry, Hyunjin whispered gently. That's your fault. Hyunjin reached across the counter carefully before intertwining their fingers. The contact felt warm and grounding, real. I still can't believe this is happening, Hyunjin admitted quietly. Felix smiled faintly. Me neither. Hyunjin's thumb brushed softly across Felix's knuckles absent-mindedly. You know what's funny? What? I spent years imagining what it would feel like to hold your hand like this. Felix's heart physically hurt hearing that, and Hyunjin looked at him with unbearable softness. It's better than I imagined. Had to look away again before he combusted. He wasn't built to survive sincerity like this. Suddenly footsteps echoed down the hallway. Both of them immediately let go of each other, too late. Han walked into the kitchen, stopped dramatically, then pointed between them with sleepy betrayal. You're being soft without me, groaned loudly. Hyunjin laughed into his coffee. Han squinted suspiciously at Felix. Why do you look like you've experienced true love and emotional devastation at the same time? Because he has, Hyunjin answered casually. Felix kicked his leg under the counter. Han gasped loudly. Oh my god, you're flirting openly now. Please lower your voice, Felix begged weakly. Han ignored him completely. You know what this means, right? Felix narrowed his eyes. What? You two are officially the dorm's most emotionally exhausting couple. Hyunjin looked proud of that title. Felix stared at him in disbelief. Why are you happy about that? Because you called us a couple again. Immediately regretted everything. Han collapsed dramatically into a chair. I'm witnessing romance before breakfast. This is traumatic. Despite the teasing, Felix couldn't stop smiling quietly into his coffee, because Hyunjin kept looking at him like he was still afraid this happiness might disappear. And maybe Felix felt the same way. But for now, sunlight filled the kitchen warmly. Hyunjin's fingers still brushed against his under the table. And for the first time in years, Felix didn't feel lonely at all. Months later. Felix would still remember that morning as the moment everything truly began, not the confession on the rooftop, not the trembling kiss under the city lights, not even the words I love you. Was the quiet afterward that changed him, the ordinary moments, the soft ones, because love, Felix realized, was not only about dramatic confessions and overwhelming emotions. Sometimes it was Hyunjin waiting outside the studio at 2 a.m. with warm coffee because he knew Felix forgot to eat again. Sometimes it was Felix silently fixing Hyunjin's hair before interviews while Hyunjin smiled at him like the entire world had narrowed into one person. Sometimes it was fighting over blankets, late-night conversations, shared exhaustion, hands finding each other instinctively in crowded rooms, and slowly, terrifyingly, Felix became used to being loved. At first it frightened him. There were nights he woke up anxious for no reason, convinced happiness like this never lasted. Years of loneliness had taught him to expect loss eventually. Sometimes he pulled away without meaning to. Sometimes he went quiet when emotions became too overwhelming, but Hyunjin never punished him for it, never made him feel difficult to love. Instead, Hyunjin learned him carefully, patiently, like memorizing a favorite song. And Felix learned Hyunjin too, learned how Hyunjin got quieter when he was secretly upset, how he hid insecurity behind teasing smiles, how deeply he cared about the people he loved, how lonely he had been long before Felix ever noticed. One winter evening, after another exhausting schedule, Felix found Hyunjin alone in the practice room sitting on the floor beneath dim lights. The mirrors reflected exhaustion from every angle. Hyunjin looked tired, not physically, emotionally. Felix walked over quietly before sitting beside him. For a while neither of them spoke. Outside, snow fell softly against the windows. Inside, only faint music played from forgotten speakers. Then Hyunjin suddenly whispered, "Do you ever think about how close we came to never having this?" Felix looked at him carefully. Hyunjin stared ahead at the mirrored wall. "If I never confessed, if you kept pretending not to notice." Felix's chest tightened, because he thought about that too sometimes. A future where they stayed trapped in silence forever, standing beside each other for years while hiding feelings that slowly destroyed them both. It felt unbearable now. Felix reached for Hyunjin's hand immediately. I would have regretted it forever, Felix admitted quietly. Hyunjin smiled faintly. Me too, leaned his head carefully against Hyunjin's shoulder. Warm, familiar home. That realization no longer scared him now. Home was never a place for Felix, not really, it was a person. And somehow impossibly that person had been Hyunjin all along. You know, Felix murmured softly, I used to think love would ruin me. Hyunjin turned slightly toward him. And now, Felix smiled, the kind of smile that only existed when he looked at Hyunjin. Now I think it saved me. Hyunjin's eyes softened instantly, then slowly, gently he pressed a kiss against Felix's forehead, the same forehead that had rested against his on that rain-soaked rooftop months ago, the same person he had loved quietly for years. Felix closed his eyes briefly, listening to Hyunjin's heartbeat beside him, steady, certain, real. Outside, snow continued falling over the city in silence. Inside the practice room, surrounded by fading music and reflected light, Felix finally understood something he had spent years searching for. Love was not the fear of losing someone. Love was finding someone who stayed. And Hyunjin stayed, always.